Welcome to the first lecture on comparative politics. In this lecture, we're going to go out some of the reasons why some people might want to study comparative politics, as well as some of the maybe reservations to those reasons, and also just go about a simple basic definition of what is comparative politics. So without further ado, let's begin. So first, let's just do some signposting. I think there's two questions to this lecture. The first one, as I said before, but more particular, why should Americans study other nations? And this is not an obvious question because for most Americans, you're not going to be a citizen of another nation, you're not going to participate in their politics, and in many cases, you'll not even be in these nations or subject to their laws. So why should studying the politics of these policies of other nations be interesting to you? The second question is what is comparative politics? Why is there a field called comparative politics, and how do we define that compared to other fields like international relations or perhaps like American politics? So why study other nations? I think there's four basic reasons. The one that's most often cited is globalization, which is the idea that it's a small world after all, and in the recent last few decades, the world has been getting smaller. Basically, increases in communication and transportation technologies have led to more interaction. And as a result, we've become more cosmopolitan. People are forced to become world citizens, and you study comparative politics just as a way to get to know your neighbors, which are more neighborly or closer than they were in the past. The second reason for American is for foreign policy. It's lonely at the top. Since World War II, the United States has basically become the world's superpower. We've been the world's policeman, to use Teddy Roosevelt's phrase, and part of comparative politics is to know your beat. If you're going to basically supervise the world, whether in the sense you want to control it or just as a matter of just keeping the peace, you have to know about some of the specifics of different countries and different regions of the world. The second reason is a little bit of just our history since World War II in dealing with different areas and some of the failures we've had, what Senator Fulbright once called the arrogance of power. A lot of the problems, particularly in Vietnam, was because we didn't really take into account the local politics of what was going on in Vietnam. We labeled it as a communist country. We said it's just like China, which is just like Russia, and we interacted with it just as if it was like the way we interacted with the Soviet Union at the time, and we got involved in a conflict that perhaps we could have avoided if we had paid more attention to the local details. And more recently in the war on terror, the invasion of Iraq. The war, occupation or invasion of Iraq basically reveals how often well-educated, dedicated decision makers often didn't understand the facts on the ground, the differences between the different groups within Iraq, their loyalties, the tribal connections, and it led to a lot of bad policies. Hopefully, if we actually knew more about these countries before we became involved in them, we would do a better job as far as both our attempts to maintain world peace, but also, let's say, defending our interests in different areas of the world. The third reason, and probably the one you hear most from comparative political scientists, is that comparative politics is about discovering the laws of politics and government. And because we have to study the world, we can't just generalize based on one country and assume that everywhere is like the United States, and if you understand American politics, then you understand politics in general. Um, you need to look at other countries. Data is plural. The more data you have, the more countries you study, the better results you're going to get. And particularly if you want to study things and you want to, let's say, test propositions about politics, you need to have some variation. And if you're studying at the system of the nation state or country level, you need to have some variation across countries. So that means you need to look at countries that are both democratic and undemocratic. It means you have to look at countries with universal health care systems and countries that do not. And so variation is a key, and the only way to get that variation is by studying other countries. And the last reason is that you want to understand America. America is often described as exceptional. It's an outlier. But if we really want to understand why our country is different, or understand some things about why we have certain policies or why we have a certain type of politics, we need to see it from the outside perspective, which means we study other countries as a way of, let's say, understanding our own country better. Part of that is so that we can expand our public policy possibility set, which means can we consider public policies that have been successful in other countries and then import them or implement them into the United States. And I think it's also very important to see yourself with other eyes, both for just being better greater understanding, but also because I think you notice things. The expression often is that a fish doesn't notice the water because the water is always around them. It's only when they're taken out of the water they realize how important the water is to their life. So let's look at some of these reasons in specific. So it's a small world after all. On the top we have two common quotations. The first one is by Metternich, who was a diplomat during the Napoleonic period, and he said, "When France sneezes, all of Europe catches a cold." And a former president of Mexico, about 100 years ago, once said, "Poor Mexico, so far from God, but so close to the United States." And all these are indicating that things that happen in other countries ultimately affect us, and so we have to understand them a little bit. Now, what's going on is this notion of globalization, that there's a conquest of time over space. And what that means is that things are not as distant anymore because we can travel over space much quicker, whether that's in terms of the internet and communication technologies or by transportation things which allow people to move from countries and also let trades of goods and services go across countries. Smaller world means you can't ignore the developments in other countries. But there's several different layers to this globalization. The first one is economic. Uh, Basically, since the 1970s, there's been a huge increase in trade, which means goods and services crossing borders. Things from China, from Japan, from energy resources from the Middle East and other places around the world, but also money. And in 2008, we got a really good sense of this, that there are these capital flows, that banks are moving money from country to country. And essentially, what the world we live in today is a one world economy where we don't have an American economy, a French economy, a Russian economy, and a China economy. We have one world economy with different pieces. And this affects Americans, I think, in two large ways. The first one is energy markets, which usually means oil. And the countries we're going to study in this course, Russia, Iran, Mexico, Nigeria, and even England to a little extent, are all significant oil producers. So, for example, if something happens in one of these countries, what you often see is an increase in gasoline prices in the United States. And the other one is finance, which means a crisis, a housing bubble, a bank failure in one country is going to spread to other countries. Most recently, this happened in 2008, where we had a global financial crisis, where things were not just bad in one part of the world, but really over the entire world. But things that may be a little less known to Americans, in 1997, there was an Asian financial crisis where you saw events spill over from one country to another. The second dimension of globalization is cultural, which means you have this, what Benjamin Barber called jihad versus Macworld, or what Francis Fukuyama called the end of history, which means that we're seeing the spread of cultures throughout the world. Since 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of communism, some people have said this is a triumph of capitalism and democracy, which basically means American culture has become world culture. If you went to other countries in the world, they're watching American movies, American TV shows, they're using American expressions, they're learning English. And so American culture, like it or not, whether you think it's a good or bad culture, is a major impact in the culture of many other countries. You can find McDonald's in the Middle East. But we should also ignore that very often we are affected by other countries in the world. If we look in high schools today, we'll find Japanese anime being very popular in comic books and movies and things of that sort. We'll see people eating sushi. We'll see people going to ethnic restaurants. And so there is this kind of sharing of culture around the world. But at the same time, we've seen some cultures kind of collapse in onto themselves, and we're seeing this by the growth of fundamentalism, most notably Islamic fundamentalism, where people are trying to turn back the clock. So rather than joining this one world culture, they're reasserting their difference, and therefore there's kind of this conflict going on, and this is also a dimension of globalization. In addition to the Middle East, we have the conflict between Chechnya and Russia. We have the different ethnicities in China, such as the Uyghurs and the Tibetans in the western part of China. We have various different ethnic groups in Nigeria. Not so recently, but a decade ago, you had separatism in the Chiapas state in Mexico. So these things are affecting most of the countries we look in the course. The third one is the moral globalization, which means we are more concerned about injustice in other countries than we were at any time in history. And this is the idea of international human rights. As Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so we care about things that are happening in other countries, and some things that will come up in the countries we'll study. We have Boko Haram, in northern Nigeria. We had the genocide going on in Darfur. In Many people have commented in Russia with the whole issue of lesbian, gay, and bisexual, transgender rights, which have been repressed in Russia. And so, if that is an issue for you, this is something where people are monitoring happening in other countries. And for American workers, worker rights in China, where if their workers are getting abused, it might affect us in a way that we weren't concerned of in the past. And the final one is security. And the large part of this is terrorism, which I think is easy to understand. Groups like Al Qaeda or Hezbollah or Somali pirates preying upon international trade have become a big issue. And we have to be concerned about them because, for example, a local conflict in Lebanon or Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia or the Horn of Africa can affect things, let's say, in the developed world, such as Western Europe and the United States. But the one sometimes we don't often think about is also narcotics and international crime. Some people might have heard about the Mexican cartels, the drug cartels on the Mexican American-Mexican border. This is certainly having an impact in our own country, but it's driven by things that are happening in another country, and also particularly the failure of the Mexican government to assert control over their own territory. In the 1990s, you saw the rise of the Russian mafia, which has become an international crime organization, which was related to the failure of the transition to capitalism in the 1990s. And you're also seeing the growth of Chinese triads, which are another an Asian type of organized crime group. So these things matter even if you're not in one of the countries. However, maybe we're exaggerating globalization, or maybe that globalization doesn't mean comparative politics is more important, but is actually less important. So one thing about globalization is that we're seeing a convergence of institutions and culture, which means countries are not as different as they were in the past. That 50 years ago, 60 years ago, there was a big difference between, let's say, the United States and France. But as we're living in a global culture, these differences have kind of gone away, at least in the developed world. And if the difference between nations is small, does that make comparative politics irrelevant? Why do we want to compare things that are basically the same? And therefore, it might not be important to study the idiosyncrasies of this country or that country, but to study global culture and not comparing them to each other. The other thing that globalization is doing is that it might, people think, is the end of the nation state. And the basic unit of comparative politics is a nation state. We compare one country with another country. But it's important to remember the nation state is a very recent development, and it might be a development that might be going away. Nation states were basically created at the end of the religious wars in Europe, what was usually called the Westphalian system, and they had cuius regio, eius religio, which means if you control the territory, if you're the state, the civil authority, you also get to assign the religion. And people thought this was the beginning of the nation state system because instead of having one religious umbrella, usually Catholicism at that time, different rulers can control the domestic politics inside their countries. And this idea of nationalism, the idea that every nation should get its own government, is really something that only started with the French Revolution just over 200 years ago. So in globalization, you're seeing two things. As I said before, jihad versus Mac world. Half the world is becoming very globalized, and another way of saying that is becoming Americanized, and there's really a sharing of one large world culture, which basically is similar through most countries. And the other half of the world is going back to the Middle Ages or becoming more local. So, for example, you see Islamic jihadists going against the governments in the Middle Eastern countries. At the same time, you're seeing the growth of global institutions or supranational institutions like the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, but also kind of media culture that crosses national boundaries. And the last thing about this is that maybe globalization is overstated. If you look at the numbers, trade is not a major part of the U.S. economy, despite what you hear. And this idea we have to be competitive with other countries might be a little bit overrated. Most Americans still don't hold passports, most Americans still don't speak foreign languages, and most Americans will never leave the United States. And so this idea that we're living in this global world with this constant movement might be more of a fantasy than a reality for the world we live in. The second reason to study comparative politics is the issue of politics and foreign policy. Over 100 years ago, Ambrose Bierce chided that war is God's way of teaching Americans geography, meaning that Americans are ignorant until we stumble into someone else's country and then we learn everything about it. And as Winston Churchill said during World War II, is that Americans only do the right thing after they try all the alternatives. And so very often our foreign policy is a series of mistakes, trial and error, which if we knew more about the areas of the world we were involved in, perhaps we would not get into these problems or we could avoid at least some of the consequences. So since World War II and the Cold War, the United States is both the world's policeman but also the world's banker. And we shifted from a foreign policy of isolationism, basically focusing on internal affairs, to one where we become incredibly involved in world politics. If something goes wrong in the world, the first question that people ask is, what is the United States going to do about it? And we have several things that kind of make that difficult for us, even if our intentions are good. And the first one, I think, is the ugly American problem. The term ugly American came from a book that was written in the 1960s referring to the Vietnam War. But Americans tend to hold this belief that we're exceptional and we think everyone should be like us. And we judge other countries by how close they are to American culture or American institutions. And understandably, a lot of people think America take a hike. To some Europeans, Americans kind of look like country bumpkins. We're unsophisticated and parochial. We exert a lot of power. We're kind of clumsy, but we don't have any type of understanding of what we're doing. And in some parts of the third world, Americans are seen as hypocritical because they see American military bases, they see the use of American economic and military power, and they think Americans talk about liberty and justice, and there seems to be a conflict between what we do and what we say. And this makes it hard for us to have foreign policies because it means we don't have support in other countries. It might make it more difficult for us to find allies or get cooperation from places as we're trying to get involved or fix problems in different regions. Another dimension of this, though, is the arrogance breeds ignorance problem. When you have as much power as the United States, you really don't need to understand the countries you're involved because you have a hammer. And when you have a hammer, everything becomes a nail. We can always send in the troops. We have the largest military. And because that's the easiest option, we often default to the military option instead of using one that would involve more nuance or more understanding of the world we're living in, perhaps diplomacy or other things. And in particular, there's a history of two major foreign policy mistakes. The first one is the Cold War in Asia, where very often we lumped all communist countries together, and we did not appreciate that nationalism was really driving these things, not capitalism versus communism. And so when we got involved in certain, particularly Southeast Asia, we kind of stumbled in, and it was very costly in many different ways, both to us but also the countries we were involved in. And you also saw this, the war on terror, particularly the invasion of Iraq, which seemed to reflect a misunderstanding of what was going on in the Middle East. And we're still, in a sense, involved in this to this very day. But on the other hand, maybe all politics is local, this foreign policy thing is exaggerated. The first thing is that Americans really are not as ignorant as some people like to say. We do actually know quite a bit about the world. People tend to emphasize the mistakes, and also that even if we perhaps had more knowledge about Vietnam or Iraq, we might not have done anything differently. It might have been driven by the worldview of the time more so than that, and even if people were more knowledgeable, they wouldn't have actually done anything differently. The other one is that foreign policy is mostly driven by power considerations, which means the reason why we have foreign policies is because we're threatened by some countries and other countries are our natural allies. And so we don't really need to know what's going on inside the boxes that are called China or Russia or India, Mexico, Iran. We have to know, how does this affect us? So I don't really need to know how decisions are made in Iran. I just need to know that Iran is a natural competitor to the United States power in the Middle East, and therefore they are not our friends. But the other part to this is that people sometimes who have been the experts in different countries, there used to be something called the Chrysanthemum Club in Japan, which were the people who were experts and scholars of Japan, that they were often too cozy or too close to the countries, that they had somehow gone native, that they were basically taking the Japanese position when they were counseling the United States. And another phrase is China hands, were people that were in China, but they weren't really helping out our country or really loyal to the United States foreign policy goals. A third part of this is that the American empire, such as it is not the British Empire. It's not your granddaddy's empire. we are not directly ruling most of the countries we're involved in. We do not have territories in Africa or India or Hong Kong. And because we're not directly involved, we don't really need as much information as, let's say, the British needed to run their empire when they were, in a sense, being the policemen of the world in the 17 and 1800s. And the final point is that maybe our foreign policy is relatively limited, and when it's not limited, we are going through other countries, and therefore we don't need to know directly. And for Americans, most of our foreign policy, if you look about what areas of the world that presidents typically talk about during election time, it's Israel Palestine, it's China, it's Western Europe, and perhaps Central America, which is mostly Mexico. Um, South Africa generally doesn't come up unless there is some ongoing human disaster going on there, whether a disease or famine or things of that sort. We're not really that connected to the large Southern American countries such as Chile, Uruguay, or Argentina, Brazil. And really, we're not that involved in South Asia other than some security things. So perhaps we don't really need to know about what's going on in some parts of the world because we're not that involved. The third area is this idea that politics is a science. David Bailey, who was a comparative study of policing organizations, often is known for the praise that you always should ask the question, compared to what? And the thing I like to say is that a point does not make a pattern make. So if you really want to understand politics, if you really want to have the eternal laws or truths of politics, you really have to be a comparativist because most of your data is in countries outside of the United States, and you need to be able to compare those countries and understand their experiences to find that some of their generalizations might not be correct. Comparative politics basically comes from three research traditions. The first one is political philosophy. This is Plato, this is Aristotle, this is Machiavelli, this is Locke, this is Hobbes, and these are political philosophy asks these big questions about politics. What is justice? What is democracy? How is a democracy stable? And comparative politics really orients itself around these big questions and trying to get empirical answers to them. The second thing was area studies, which meant that comparative politics came from experts on world history and particularly the political history of different countries around the world. So these are people who might know everything about Brazil, everything about Tanzania, everything about Afghanistan, and they realized that even though they studied different areas of the world, they did have some commonalities between regions, and they started to talk to each other and compare. And finally, it came from 20th century, 19th century sociology, basically, which was concerned with the ideas and institutions of the modern world, the world created by the increase in democracy and the rise of capitalism because of the French and industrial revolutions. And so, really looking at what does democracy mean around the world? What does capitalism mean around the world? Why has nationalism become such a strong force in the last 200 years? And to get really good answers to any of these questions, you have to basically be a comparativist. You have to be able to go outside of your own little area and start looking at your country and use to compare and contrast with other countries' experiences. However, perhaps we don't really need to know political science is a misnomer, and particularly comparative politics might not be as important as it was in the past. The rise of the internet means there's been a democratization of knowledge, which means amateurs know almost as much as experts because, in some senses, if you have a good Twitter feed, you will find about things just as soon as people who are area experts. They know only a little bit more than you. And so specialized knowledge of different areas of the world is not as important now as it was in the past. We're not working with the communications of the Telegraph Society. We are in a Twitter world where things are instantaneous, and you can go to the internet and find pretty good material on different areas of the world. For myself, um, I used to think that I was fairly well read in comparative politics. I knew a lot more than a lot of people, but really almost any high school student with access to the internet could know what's going on in a lot of different countries of the world and be a quick study. The second part is that these big questions are not big questions anymore because we've had what's called the end of history. In 1989, capitalism, democracy beat communism and authoritarian governments, and therefore these questions are settled, or at least they're not interesting questions anymore. So we're not really interested about the fate of democracy and the future of capitalism because we know how the story ends. Democracy and capitalism wins, socialism and authoritarianism lose, and therefore, you know, we've kind of reached the end for these modern sociology questions. The other thing is that political science might be what's called a degenerate discipline. it's not really a science despite their pretensions. It's not about politics, it's not about a science. Very often the use of data is a misuse, and therefore perhaps this is a failed dream for the area discipline of political science. But I think also in the United States, what's been problematic for people who want to study politics as a science is that there's been a politicalization of policy, which means everything is about what side are you on? Are you red or blue? Democrat or Republican? And so there's really no audience for people who want neutral scientific analysis of politics. People are not interested, for example, in the healthcare debate about what you might have studied about the Swiss healthcare system, or, for example, the German healthcare system, or the Canadian healthcare system. So any of that knowledge about studying foreign countries, thinking it will help or improve the American policy debate, at least in the environment of the last 10 to 20 years, is probably a fruitless wish. What I think is most important is that we understand America, that comparative politics really isn't about studying other countries. It's a strategy of understanding your own country. And I love this quote by G.K. Chesterton where he says, we don't travel to see other countries. We travel so that when we return from these other countries, we can see our own country as a foreign land, which means we get a perspective we didn't have before. And Machiavelli kind of hints at this in the opening to his Prince. He says, the reason I can write this book, The Prince, is because I'm a common person, and therefore I have the best perspective about princes, just as princes from their exalted place can understand the people, just as people do landscape paintings of mountains from the valley and pictures of the valley from the top of mountains. And there's probably a lot of truth to this because of the great studies of American politics, most of them are written by foreigners. We have Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, written in the 1830s. Less famous but known to political scientists, Lord Bryce wrote The American Commonwealth in the late 1800s, which I think to this day is considered one of the more interesting studies of the American system, especially, let's say, in the Progressive era. And finally, probably the greatest study of American race issues and problems was written by Gunnar Myrdal, a Swedish economist in the 1940s, and called An American Dilemma. And even though it's now 70 years old, I think it's something that if you read it today, it was one of the most scientific and detailed studies of how racism worked as a system in the United States. Distance equals perspective. As I said before, fish don't notice the water because it's always there. Only when you're out of the water do you appreciate it. The reverse is true of humans. You probably don't think about oxygen until you're underwater, and oxygen is scarce. And so something about distance and perspective can help us gain a better understanding. There's also some questions like the answer by the United States, like the role of immigration. Immigration, some of those people criticize our immigration policy, but in the sense that we've had many more immigrants and we're a much more diverse country, we can appreciate what the United States has accomplished by looking at most of the countries of the world which have had equally troubled immigration policies. We can understand, for example, why race continues to play a role in the United States. But you really only understand that if you look at countries like Brazil and South Africa that also had major issues historically with the race issues. Some of them have been done better than us, some of them not done so well. Do checks and balances prevent tyranny? According to the founders, they do, but that might not be the case. And I think you need to look at other countries to understand that. If you want to understand why we have a high murder rate, a very high, relatively high crime rate, why we incarcerate so many people, you really need to look at the criminal justice systems around the world. And questions about taxes and healthcare, you really are getting a better perspective if you look at the politics in other countries. Now, the other reason is that sometimes people use foreign countries to make arguments, and if you study other countries, you won't be, let's say, drawn into the simple comparisons that are typical make. And on the internet, there's something called Godwin's Law, which is that any long discussion about politics on the internet will eventually end with someone making a comparison to Hitler or the Nazis, at which points the other person wins the debate and the debate is over. You can look at here about the specific history, but kind of a simplistic way to talk about politics is that everything is compared to Nazis or Hitler, commies or Stalin, the fall of the Roman Empire, the Spanish Inquisition, the Great Depression for economics, civil rights, Martin Luther King and Gandhi, and 9/11. And what this is sometimes, I think, is what's called a drunkard search. A drunkard search refers to a drunk person who's looking for his keys which he lost, and he's standing by a lamppost. And so he's looking in the light of the lamppost, and he's just not able to find his keys. Someone comes up to him and says, "Where'd you lose your keys?" He goes, "I lost them down the street, but this is the only place I can see, so I'm looking here." Meaning that if you only know a few examples about the world, you're going to make everything, you're going to make all these overreached analogies, you're going to do a reduction to absurdity, which means that everything is going to be reduced. And I think also there's kind of this humbug fallacy where people will pretend to know a lot by citing examples that maybe you don't know about. Like, for example, on tax policy, recently an academic invoked the tax policies of the Roman Empire under Diocletian, which is like saying you don't know the details and therefore I win because I can cite more obscure facts than you can. Um, but mostly, if the more you know about other countries, you're going to make better analogies. You're going to realize that perhaps the 2008 financial crisis has very little to do with the Great Depression and probably has more to do with the first Great Depression of the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, which until the 1930s was known as the Great Depression. But another part of this is expanding the possibilities. There is a tendency in America, and please forgive me for misspelling exceptionalism. Um, American exceptionalism is this belief that we're number one and we have nothing to learn from other countries. Um, Comparative politics is based on the belief that sometimes other countries sometimes do things better than us, and sometimes other countries do things considerably worse than us. But we can learn from making the comparison. And just as a simple list, uh, stands out if you had to compare the world, we don't do a very good job on crime, whether it's for incarceration policy, discrimination in crime, or just frankly the levels of violent crime in our country. Our healthcare system is expensive and arguably very inefficient. Uh, we don't collect taxes well, and I'm not talking about what percentage we're taking in taxes, but even the taxes we levy, we don't collect them in a particularly economically efficient way. Many people would criticize the United States that our primary and secondary education systems is fundamentally broken, and we often hear comparisons to countries like Finland, Korea, China, Japan, saying they might be better models about how to organize education. And also, we have very low voter registration for a democracy and very low turnout. And if that's an issue that Americans are not participating, you might want to go look into other countries and why they succeed uh, better than we do. Just for example, in Italy, if you don't vote, what they do is they put your name out in the town square, and everyone knows that you didn't vote. And that's usually enough of a motivation for you to actually make the effort to go to the polls and cast your ballot. Sometimes other countries do worse, and these examples are mostly not because these are things we do particularly well, but sometimes these are things that come under criticism, but I think we do a better job than most. We have very good civil law courts. It's very easy to sue, which means we can get remedies to problem disputes, and we tend to forget that sometimes other countries do not have these mechanisms, and that can be incredibly frustrating. I think we actually do a relatively good job with immigration, with all the warts that it has, that we are a very diverse country. We have incorporated a lot of different people. It hasn't always been easy. It could be a lot better. But most countries generally do not have very much immigration and essentially do well because they don't have fewer immigrants. We're starting to see some countries in Northern Europe take in more immigrants than they had in the past, and they're struggling in ways that they hadn't anticipated. We still have some of the best public universities, both in terms of education, but also in terms of research and development. Um, Despite all the problems with the Federal Reserve, arguably over the last 10 years, our central banks have done a lot better than, let's say, Europe's or Japan's central banks. And if one thing that gets copied about the United States is that people really like our constitutional courts, meaning the Supreme Court. It's really the one thing that when people build new governments, they really copy our Supreme Court. So comparative politics can give us better ideas about American politics and policy. The last thing I think is that don't be fooled. And don't be fooled, which means very often people cite foreign examples because very often they think the audience knows less about what's happening in obscure foreign countries, and therefore you won't be able to fact check them. And what Joan Robinson said about economics, I think, is true about comparative politics. You study it not to get a set of facts. You study it because there are people out there trying to trick you, and the only way to avoid them tricking you is to know as much as they do and to catch them in their lies. So foreign nations are often used in discussions about policy in the United States and discussions about politics. Uh, why? First one is the public is generally ignorant, which makes it much easier to lie. I can tell you things about Canadian healthcare. I can tell you things about socialism in Europe. I can tell you things about Kenyan anti-colonialism. I can tell you things about Zimbabwe's economic policy, and you're likely to not know anything different, and so you'll have to take my word. So as I said, France, cheese-eating surrender monkeys. Europe is a socialist hellhole. Latin America and Africa are just poor, backward charity cases. And I think, despite their problems, we tend to have an overly critical view of Africa, and we tend to ignore countries like Botswana, which has really been a success story, both in terms of economics and politics, despite getting the brunt of the AIDS epidemic. Um, People will say, well, people in the Middle East hate our freedom. Uh, that's a very simplistic view of the Middle East and probably not particularly helpful. The last is that, you can criticize people who use foreign examples by saying, well, it's un-American. As many people have said, patriotism is the last refuge of scoundrels, and you can see here this Swedish map with the socialist emblem in the center. Um, we don't like the metric system. It's a foreign system. Uh, Football means something different to us. Soccer is un-American, despite all the efforts to get Americans involved in politics, involved in soccer. And also this kind of belief that the American Constitution is basically perfect and can't be improved on. So very often we don't improve our system. We have a lot of clunky aspects to our Constitution, such as the Electoral College, arguably the presidential democracy, but for some people, and there's really little consideration about improving it. And finally, I think there's often appeals to cultural affinity, which means countries who like us must be right. If they're our ally, despite whatever is happening on the ground in their country, we respect their opinions. Countries who are not like us, we tend to disagree with them. And you see this in terms of economic policy in Europe, where Germany is often portrayed as responsible, mostly because we as Americans can probably identify with Germany both by the level of development and as an ally. And while Greece has been portrayed as irresponsible, mostly because we have less in common, and Greece is in some ways not on the same level of development as ourselves, and therefore we tend to infer that, well, Greece must have done something wrong and Germany must be doing something right, even though that might not be the case. So let me just go back to the question, what is comparative politics? And I have several kind of versions of this. A short version is that comparative politics is politics and government outside the United States. That's not a great definition, but basically if you said, what are we doing? We're basically studying politics and government, and we exclude the United States, although in fact most comparative politics do include the United States in their comparisons. Another short version is that comparative politics is what comparative political scientists do. And so whatever they do basically becomes comparative politics because it's a pretty diverse body of research. So basically, if it's published in the two leading journals, World Politics and Comparative Political Studies, it's comparative politics. And so whatever the editors of those journals decide is worth publishing becomes a question or an issue for the field. The technical version, and the one that I kind of prefer, is that it's about patterns and variations. There are differences around countries, and we can find patterns, which means similarities and differences across countries. We're looking at differences in political phenomena, hence the politics. We tend to use what's called the comparative method, which means we're not using statistics, we're not using experiments. We're doing paired comparisons of countries or countries' experiences to address these questions. And the questions we're asking are the questions of Tocqueville, Weber, Durkheim, the big questions about what's the nature of democracy and what's the nature of capitalism. So that's all for this introductory lecture. Thank you for listening.